Hello, I'm here today to talk to you about debugging with Logger in Ruby. So this is me. You can find me online at LionsInBeta on Twitter or lionsinbeta.com, or if you're really old school, you can email me. Twitter is probably more direct. So before we can talk about Logger, we really have to talk about puts. So let's say you have this code in Ruby. We've got a nums array, some random numbers, and then it's going to be passed into this sort and reverse method. And inside that method, it's going to sort the array, then reverse the array, and then it's going to return the array. And then at the end of our little script, we have the original array is going to be outputted, and then the sorted and reversed array is going to be outputted. So let's switch into the terminal and run that code. And what we actually end up with is the original array both times. So it doesn't look like any changes actually happened. So we didn't get what we expected. How can we try and find out where the problem is? So most of you have probably done this. I know when I first started with Ruby, this is pretty much the only way I was ever shown to debug basic code. You just throw a bunch of put statements in there. So you can see now we've added puts and then the array, and then we're going to sort it, and then we're going to puts the array again, and then we're going to reverse it, and then we're going to puts the array a final time, and then we still have our normal output. So we're going to probably get a lot more output in the terminal when we run this code. So let's see what this looks like. And we have a lot more output, and every time the array appears, it's appearing the same unsorted, unreversed way. And also now we've exposed a side effect. So at the end where it says the sorted and reversed order is, it's blank. The reason for that is when we added those put statements to our method, puts is actually returning nil. So the final statement in the array, that put statement, in the method is returning nil, and that's having a side effect on our code. So we now know the problem. We're not actually making permanent changes to the array. So we did get something out of using puts. We strip out our put statements. We have this code now. We're going to use variable assignment, and we're going to assign array.sort to sorted. Then we're going to take sorted and reverse it and assign that to reverse sorted. We're going to make sure we return the actual item we want returned at the end. And then if we run this code, let's take a look at that in the terminal. Now we can see we get the output we expect. So the original order and then the sorted and reversed order are the arrays that we actually expected them to be. So good. So that seems like it works. So what's the real problem here? Why do we need to do something different when that seemed like it worked fine? So let's take a look at that same problem using the logger instead of puts. So we're going to skip right to the second step, but first we need to get logger into our code. So I'm going to go through this block one line at a time later, but the great thing about Logger is that it's pretty consequence-free, it's very lightweight, and it's part of the standard library. So we can actually just drop this right into the head of any file we have, and this is going to add a logger to our script or to our app or to our command line utility or to whatever we're building. And this creates a class, mylog, and then it's creating a class method, which means we don't even have to pass a logger object around. We can actually just use this class and call to it directly and act on this object without instantiating it and passing an instance around. So here we have the same kind of code we had in step 2 before, except instead of all those put statements, we now have these mylog.log.debug statements. So it looks pretty similar so far. Let's take a look at what this output actually looks like. So back in the terminal, I'm going to run Ruby, and here we go. A lot of the same kind of output. I can see my arrays still aren't changed, so we've kind of exposed the same problem that we did with puts. The main difference is over here we have these kind of nicely formatted, easily readable debug lines. We can see when this was added to the log, and then it's just much more nicely formatted than our put statements were. So we can still do the same solution here. I'm just going to add some variable assignment. So I have my sorted equals array.sort, and then my sorted.reverse is being assigned to reverse sorted. And you can see the biggest difference here is that I haven't removed these log statements, right? So let's make sure that this code actually works. Since I made changes, we should run it to make sure everything's good. And sure enough, we're getting the output we actually expected now. You can see in the debug lines that we're actually making changes one at a time, and then the output of the original array and the sorted and reversed array, just like we expected. But those debug lines are still in there. So as you can see now, this is back up in where we added logger into our code. I've made just this one change. So all I did was I changed the logger level from debug up to info. So you can see here, this is the only change I've made to the code that I just ran. You can see all the rest of this is exactly the same. And if I come into the terminal and I run this last block, now those debug lines are suddenly gone, even though they were still in my code. So right away, you can see one of the greatest advantages of debugging with the logger is that it's going to allow us to leave these logging statements in place instead of having to constantly add and remove them. So really, what is logging? Like, what are we doing that's different than puts? Well, this is what the Ruby docs have to say as of 2.1.3. So the logger class provides a simple but sophisticated logging utility that you can use to output. Okay, whatever. It's a record of stuff that happened. That's what we really have. The logger just lets you make a record of stuff that happened in your app. So let's talk about log files now. A minute ago, we were just outputting directly to the console. And there's nothing wrong with that, but if you're building a command line utility, you may not want those debug info lines cluttering up your console output. You may want to write those to a file. That's another big advantage of logger is writing out to something besides standard out is built right in, so you don't have to kind of roll your own every time. So right here you can see when we added the logger in, we added it with standard out. And if we just change that to a file name, it will just create and append to that file. So based on that configuration we used, this is what some sample log output would look like. So let's break this down into its components. First, we have the level. So the level is shown in two places, because why not? Sometimes redundancy is okay. And this helps for sortability tremendously. So if you want to look through your logs and just see all of the debug lines or all of the fatal error lines, you can sort easily because these words and the letter are always going to be right there at the start of every line. You can set the level here where we changed it earlier from debug to info. And what that does is control the lowest level of logs that will be written to your log file or to the console. So what does that mean? Well, we have different levels that we can use with the logger. We have debug, which is for absolute lowest level debugging and troubleshooting. We have info, which is just getting output from your app of kind of general kind. A lot of database apps will give you transactional data as part of the database, but if you want to log activities that are happening in your app, that might be a time you would use info. The warning level is for warnings. So these can be warnings you show to the user or not. Maybe you want to keep track of things that are going weirdly, but it's not necessarily overtly affecting the user experience. So you may log those warnings and then not actually send them to your user's interface. The error level, these you might do both with. You might show these to your users and you definitely would want to know about them. If you have anybody else who's using your code besides you, this is great for troubleshooting because if you look into their logs and there's tons and tons of errors, then that's a quick way to see either there's something wrong with your app or there's something wrong with the way your user was interacting with it. Fatal is when the app is actually crashed. So normally a fatal error log is going to be paired with an ensure block so that this actually gets written to the log even though your app is crashed. And we're not going to talk about ensure blocks today, but those would usually go hand in hand to make absolutely sure that log line gets written before the app is completely terminated. And then finally, the unknown level is kind of funny because it always writes to the log. So if you want something that no matter what the log level is set at, either by yourself or by the user, it's always going to get written to the log, then you can use this unknown log level. And to paraphrase Donald Rumsfeld, there are no knowns and there are known unknowns, but there should not be any unknown unknowns, so let's just always write that to the log. The next part of this log output is the timestamp. So if you're using standard output, this might be overkill because you know that the log was always just generated right in front of you. But if you're writing to log files, you're definitely going to want to know when that interaction was generated, when that debug line came up, when that warning came up, when that fatal crash came up, because that might just help you in your troubleshooting process. And as you can see here, when we actually added logger to our script, we were able to set the date time format. And the format that I have is basically the ISO 8601 standard. If you have to change this, you can, but unless you have a really good reason, I encourage you to leave it this way. This is universally understood. It's very searchable. It's very programmatically mungeable. So this is a good format. There's a reason this is a standard and not the terrible various versions of date times that we see in other software. And then the most important part of the log is probably going to be your message. So this is where you're going to output variables, where you're going to output strings, where you're going to output the result of a method. And you can see right here where we actually sent data to each of these debug calls. We have a string and then we've interpolated in the value of a variable. We could just as easily have put only the variable. We could put method calls in here. We could actually execute code. So if I put the string 2 plus 2, then the log would have the string 2 plus 2 in it. If I put 2 plus 2 just as a statement, then the log would actually contain 4 because that is the result of the statement 2 plus 2. So let's do a little recap. Stop using puts to debug. I know it's easy, it's quick to add, but once you get into the logger habit, it'll just make things way easier for you. Having to add and remove put statements all the time to get the contents of variables or to track your app is just a huge time sink. It clutters up your output because it's going to be writing a lot of stuff to the console. And if you want to write to files, that's just going to be extra work on your part every time you need to add that into your code. Plus, put statements can have very weird side effects on your code, as we saw with the nil return. So do use the logger. It is actually meant for this. So it's out of the box, much better designed for debugging, troubleshooting, logging, and keeping track of what's happening in your app. It lets you write to files a lot easier. And most of the time, that's how you're going to use your logs. You're not going to be sending a tremendous amount of information to standard out. And then finally, debug like a champ. Thank you very much.